Thank you so much, Leona, for inviting me to speak. It's really my pleasure to be here, and thank you for holding on to the bitter end. So I'll try and, my presentation isn't too long, so just talk you through. I think my approach is actually something quite different to what we've heard today, so hopefully it's new. But really what I want to talk about, in addition to my own experience as a journalist, is the whole idea of mental health. Like, what are we actually even talking about? Let's go right back to the beginning. Before we start to think about what's happening to us, before we start to think about support offerings, what about the questions that we might have assumed about mental health that we might not have got quite right? So that's what I'm going to talk about. And I do tread this weird line where I'm a practicing psychotherapist and I am still a journalist in a newsroom. So some days I sit with people talking about how they've been sexually abused and my eyes well up and my heart just, aches for them. And then other days I'm in an edit suite watching something equally as horrific and I'm having to do something completely different, which is kind of galvanize myself and, and armor up. And I find that that's taught me quite a lot about what does and doesn't happen in newsrooms and what maybe ways that we could do things differently. So quickly, just what I wanted to share to you today, is my own experiences as a journalist. I've been working for Sky News for 14 years. We tend to stay for quite a long time. But I also worked at Al Jazeera English, ITN, a couple of shifts at Channel 4, and I was a journalist back in Australia in the early 2000s as well. So I've sort of done my fair share of journalism. So really the kind of most important part of my presentation today is to talk about this idea that mental health is actually a really contested area. So I was really surprised as a journalist becoming a psychotherapist when I learned that the things that I just assumed were facts were actually people's opinions on what's happening when we talk about mental and emotional distress. And I was really surprised by that. Some of those things I thought were really were truths, and they weren't truths. They were just opinions. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And we've heard a lot about trauma and body and post-orgasmic experience, so I won't anything that's been said today, I'll kind of canter over, but there's some stuff that I might add that might sort of add to what's been said already. And of course, what this means for us as journalists, like, why is all this even important? Well, as journalists, surely we want to be able to do our job better, to do our job and to not burn out, and to write better stories. I think that's really the key thing for me that I learned is this is actually really about good journalism. All of this makes sense. If you want to look at it purely from a functional point of view, this is being emotionally intelligent in newsrooms is how you do better journalism. And I think that's a great way to be able to sell it to maybe those recalcitrant bosses who maybe are not quite on board with the emotional intelligence side of things just yet. So I was having dinner with a correspondent the other night, and I said to him, I realized when I became a psychotherapist that 14 years of unedited news had passed through my body in Sky News. Everything from the Arab uprising to beheadings that I had to watch and figure out if we could use some of the footage, to dead children washing up on beaches. All of that had kind of just flooded in through my brain, through my prefrontal cortex, and had just poured into my body. And it was a humbling experience to train as a psychotherapist and have hundreds and hundreds of hours of personal psychotherapy, which is what we have to do, and to watch that come out and what that looked like. And I felt real sadness for my colleagues who I can now see with the clinician's eyes and see the level of overwhelm that they're all sitting with. And they don't even understand. They don't even get their level of dissociation, their level of disconnection. And I want to help them. I think we all do. And I think this is the start of something. I hope it's the start of something for us actually helping them to see what they can't yet see. So I'll just talk about some new approaches. So trauma, it's this word that gets thrown around, but things that get forgotten about trauma is that it's actually understandable. It's a mental and emotional distress happens for a reason. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's necessary. So believe it or not, there is an adaptation taking place when you become traumatized. Your mind and your body never ever does anything to hurt you on purpose, but it will hurt you and make you suffer if you don't understand what you're sitting with. And so there is a process of adaptation taking place in order to survive something that's completely intolerable, pushing it down, boxing it up, keeping it out of your mind so you can function until it comes out later. So I didn't even like the word PTSD. I think we should drop the D altogether. I don't believe that it is a disorder. I think if you see something traumatizing and you're traumatized, that's probably a normal response to abnormal circumstances. So I work with someone who has changed it to post-traumatic stress display. I just say post-traumatic stress. I mean, let's just drop the disorder. It's not a disorder. It's what happens to people when they're impacted by something awful. And it's protective. The adaptation and its reasons for happening are needed in order to protect us emotionally and psychologically. So I think it's really, really important, because if we start from the premise that people are not ill, but they're actually responding in a perfectly normal way to what we expect to happen, then are we offering resilience and kind of and programs at the end of the line when the crisis has happened, or are we actually thinking from the very beginning, okay, everyone who goes into this newsroom will be traumatized, every single person. And that's what I think actually is taking place and has taken place. I see that as a clinician working in a newsroom. You're all overwhelmed. You're dissociated. You're completely emotionally connected. You're not responding properly, and it's normalized. And that's just newsroom culture. That's what most newsrooms are like. And that's kind of expected, because you've got to be able to survive this somehow. So it's not wrong. It's just people don't understand what's happened to them. Just want to play you this clip. It's a 1 minute. It's from Nathan Filer. He's an amazing mental health nurse, wrote a book called The Shock of the Fall. And this is an interview where he's talking about, so what I'm really trying to get at here is, let's rethink mental health. Let's think of like what mental health actually is. And I think this 1 minute really kind of sums it up. Hopefully it will play.
Talking about schizophrenia, you say in the mad, mad world of mental health care, language is everything. If it isn't everything, you must mean it's crucial.
It's really crucial. I think a truth not widely appreciated is that for the overwhelming majority of what we confidently call the mental illnesses, these are not arrived at by looking at a blood test or a brain scan or any objective physical test of the kind used routinely to confirm diagnoses in other fields of medicine. And they can't be, because these tests don't exist. So rather, it is the words people say or do not say, as interpreted by health professionals, that as much as anything else will determine a diagnosis.
So we can never get round behind language and find the thing, because we're always using language to describe it, so we can never sort of be language free in a way.
Exactly that. Well, so far we haven't been able to, and people have been trying, and a lot of money's been spent trying to find these biological causes. But so far we've not been able to do that. So that language is central, and then the language of diagnosis, for better or worse, has the power to profoundly alter people's lives again.
Okay, so let me just make all of this concrete for you really easily. And this is the thing that blew me away when I walked into a psychotherapy training as a journalist, thinking that all of these things were done deal, signed, delivered. We understood exactly what depression was. We understood exactly what anxiety was. We understood exactly what schizophrenia was. And the revelation to me was, we don't know anything. These are people's opinions. Let me give you an example. Royal College of Psychiatrists. Depression could be a severe and debilitating illness, but with the right treatment and support, most people can make a full recovery. So that was said by the outgoing president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, Dr. James, a fantastic psychiatrist, one of the preeminent kind of mental health organizations in the UK. Debilitating illness. Let's go to the British Psychological Society, another really important big mental health organization in the UK. They say the exact opposite. Depression is best thought of as an experience or a set of experiences rather than a disease. The experience we call depression is a form of distress. That's in a very famous report called Understanding Depression. The depth of distress itself, as well as the contributing events and circumstances, can be life-changing and even life-threatening. This is the key part. However, calling it an illness is only one way of thinking about it. So you've got the Royal College of Psychiatrists saying depression is definitely an illness. You've got the British Psychological Society saying it's definitely not an illness, although it could be an illness. It's just one way of thinking about it. Why does that matter? Because we do stuff like this. The NHS Digital puts out press releases like this that says that a quarter of the entire country is mentally disordered. After a pandemic, when you have the Royal College of Psychiatrists calling it a disorder, and you have the psychologists saying, well, it's not about what's wrong with you, it's actually about what happened and why that matters. It's very, very difficult as a young person to look at a press article like this and think, well, God, I mean, a quarter of the people around me have a clinically diagnosable mental health disorder. Let me just play you a bit of a consultant clinical psychologist called Lucy Johnston, who's very, very famous in the field for kind of trying to call out where we're going completely wrong with mental health and why this is causing some big problems.
Impact on insecure families, as many of these children do. We're living in a difficult world. Children are a barometer of our society. We cannot go on waiting until every single child in the country is labelled with a disorder and is on a clinic waiting list. We do need more resources for mental health difficulties, but we also need to look very clearly at the kind of world we're bringing our children into, and we need to address this distress much more, I think, at its root causes.
Okay, stop that there. So I had a battle at Sky to say, sorry, let me just get this onto the right slide now. Okay, how do I get that? There we go. Sorry, there we go. That's the slide I want. So I got that press release and I was just like, guys, we're not the PR department for NHS Digital. Where's the journalism? Have you rung a psychologist and asked them whether they think a quarter of the entire country has a mental health disorder? And I was told, well, it's NHS Digital. Who are we to do some journalism, to pick up the phone and figure out, is this true? So we softened the language at Sky, thank goodness. I got the editors to listen to me. I said, let's go with mental health problems. At least then people don't think that they're broken and ill because they've gone through a pandemic. You know, surviving a pandemic is unprecedented. We don't know what that does to someone's mental and emotional distress. And I think that we need to really rethink this idea that everyone needs a medical label and the concomitant medication that might follow that. Of course, medication can be part of the solution, but it's not the full picture. And I think we need to always be looking at what's underneath, what's the reason why people feel the way they feel.
The language is everything, whether it comes to the way your manager speaks to you or the way people at NHS Digital actually, broadcast these issues.
Yep.
Language is everything. There's certain words can trigger certain things in certain people at certain times.
Yeah, and it's very damaging to have on your record in your workplace suffered a mental breakdown, whereas was suffering normal expected response to war zone experiences. That's a very different thing to have on your record. That's a very different story to take on. And I think this is really where we're going in the wrong direction, because we're kind of making things an individual problem and not looking at actually these are the things that we should expect to happen if we're going to ask people to do these kind of emotional jobs with lots of emotional labour, as Maya was saying.
Just one thing on the disorder language. I also, I think, probably acknowledge that in some instances that can be helpful to people.
It's a good point, yeah.
So, certainly for me, I knew I had PTSD, but being able to get a diagnosis led me to be able to get the clinical help I needed.
It's such an important point, yeah.
If we didn't have that messed up situation where A leads us to B, then it'd be easier, right? But sometimes it does.
So I think the key thing is choice. And so you can be told, the one way of framing this is to think about it as a disorder. However, there are no blood tests, there are no brain scans, and this is a theory that someone has come up with. I could go back through all the medical history of where these come from. But you need to understand that this is not diabetes and this is not cancer. This is a theory. And I think it's up to you to decide whether that framework is helpful. But the key thing that we're trying to kind of bring into the mainstream media at the moment, I can talk about how we're doing that, is to say there's other worldviews. And in some cases, you're much better off to go through these experiences in a country like India or Brazil. If you've got schizophrenia, a presentation of schizophrenia, you get a much better response working with a shaman in Brazil than you do in the current psychiatric system here in the UK. We don't know why that is, but that's very interesting. That a shaman might be interested in what the voices are actually saying as opposed to just trying to shut them down. So I'm just trying to say the importance is that you get a choice when you decide whether or not the diagnostic framework is what you want to use to understand your experiences. So we've been training, just very quickly if anyone wants this, we've been training lots and lots of mental health professionals who work in different ways: psychiatrists, authors, clinical psychologists, surgeons, people from both sides of the pond. If anyone wants access to this database, these are some of the best people that I've come across. So what I did is I went out and just found everyone that I thought needed to be on TV and radio and said, let me give you broadcast media training so that you're talking, because you're so busy being amazing at what you do that we're getting the same people on air again and again and again saying, you know, I don't mean to belittle this, but we need to talk about the mental health stigma. Okay, I get that, but it's not about an individual person's problem, and that's what the stigma conversation does. These are big systemic problems, and when people are the barometer of our society, when they're not well, it tells us that something's drastically wrong at a systemic level. And if you just talk about the mental health stigma, then what you're doing is you're saying, it's okay, it's all right that you have depression, you can talk about it, rather than going, well, the reason why they're depressed is because they're working in a really terrible environment with management who don't understand what they're going through, and their display of depression is actually what we would expect. If any one of us had gone through something like that, we may have ended up in the same boat. Sorry, I'm so bad at figuring out how to turn the slideshow back on. Current slide, there we go. So here's a good example of it. I went looking for journalists' mental health crisis, and this is the image that I found. So keeping in mind in the 21st century, the broad paradigm that we're in is one of digital, open up the brain, change the broken chips, fix your broken head. That's the image. When you see that, you see a journalist who's been broken. It's the brain, not the body. As a psychotherapist, 90% of what I'm working with is not the brain. I'm working with someone's dysregulated nervous system. I'm working with their body. The body's not even part of the picture or part of the story, and a lot of people don't understand that that's really where you have to start, from the ground up. So I went through my own mental health crisis in January 2022. After 14 years of being the kind of filter of Sky News, it was enough, and I crashed and burned, and it was really deeply unpleasant, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. It was one of the most painful things I've ever gone through in my life. And I was a clinician at the time as well. So it was quite interesting on one level to watch what I understood was happening and to feel it from the inside out. And I used this picture not accidentally, because I spent so much time walking outside on the grass to just try and regulate my system, to just try and ground myself. But I also think the problem in newsroom support is it's like, well, how can we fix them? How can we actually do something to cover us, to tick the boxes and to fix them? It's not about trying to fix. It's about understanding that trauma is a normal process. It's what happens. It's expected. And if you understand how to regulate a nervous system, then none of this needs to happen. Like, it's actually not rocket science how to do good trauma work. We've understood how to do it for decades, and yet for some reason we're not doing it. And it's not very difficult, and it's not even very expensive, as Hannah's pointed out. I'll just go over that very quickly. I think we've gone over the nervous system enough today. You get one side of the autonomic nervous system is the stress response, and one side is the parasympathetic. So we're just trying to bring people back into regulation. They're stuck in the sympathetic response. They're stuck in fight or flight, highly adrenalized. They become addicted to the places that they're in. We know that war correspondents start to crave the thrill, the intensity of the war zone, because their entire nervous systems have been rewired. And if you spend all of your time in a newsroom that's kind of feeding you these kind of really highly adrenalized images, then your nervous system changes permanently. And that can be very damaging. It can cause all sorts of things like IBS, it can cause autoimmune diseases, it can cause fibromyalgia, migraines, you name it. I mean, so it's really like, it's not good to not be regulating your nervous system. And I do worry about how much time my nervous system was dysregulated. So yeah, just reframing trauma as a process. I thought this quote from the owner's book was amazing. David McIlveen, is it? To put a lens close to the face of someone as they grapple with a grief so fresh, so raw, that they look completely lost requires a blend of absolute empathy and a hard-learned detachment, if only as a personal shield. I really resonated with absolute empathy and hard-learned detachment, and that's such an impossible kind of wire to walk across, where on one hand you're trying to feel, and on another hand you're trying to not make the story about you. And I think to acknowledge that what we're asking journalists to do is really hard. it's really, really, that kind of emotional labor is really, really tough. And one other quick thing I should say is, as a psychotherapist, I see things probably not as bad as journalists. I hear them. And for every 4 hours of clinical work I do, I have 1 hour of clinical supervision, where I sit with someone and I tip out the jug, so to speak. So can you imagine, like, you know, for every 4 hours, if I add up all my Sky News hours and all of the beheadings and all of the dead bodies and all that, and where was the way to tip that out? Well, it was in 2022 when I spent 3 months surfing because I could barely get out of bed. That's what that looked like, and I wouldn't want anyone else to have to get to that point.
What process did you go through to get better?
So I stopped watching news altogether for 3 months. I started to write a children's book, and so I started to get involved in things that were quite fun and joyful again. I remembered that the lion's share of humanity are good, and I reminded myself of that by going to art galleries and connecting with the land and listening to music and remembering things from my childhood that I enjoyed doing. I got in a car and I drove around the UK for a month and had no destination and just stayed in hotels. It was in the pandemic, and it was probably the funnest month of my life, whilst I was simultaneously bawling my eyes out. So it was a very strange time, but it was a gift that I couldn't give myself because I would have never given myself permission to stop. And the funny thing is, when I got back to Sky News, someone said to me, "Were you on nights? Were you on the night shift?" I was like, "No, I had a mental breakdown. I was off for 3 months." And they were like, "Oh, welcome back." You know, so it's like no one knew I was even gone. So just take the time off. Like, you know, the newsroom goes on. It absolutely goes on.
But I think your point there about joy, James, is something that, you know, I was at this Perugia Journalism Festival a few weeks ago, and there was a fantastic Mexican psychotherapist there, and she was just saying joy is such an important thing that actually we lose sense of, we lose sight of, we feel like we're not allowed to give ourselves permission to go and do goofy things.
Yeah.
And I think that it's just so important that even if it's just a couple of minutes a day, like we have a kitchen disco at home sometimes, so me and my kids dance around the kitchen to really crap music and we all sing really badly. But just having something like that, it just allows you to just be.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important what you just said there. So
Thank you. Yeah. Look.
If I could just add
Yeah,
on the
sure.
first thing that you said you didn't watch the news for a month.
For longer, yeah, I refuse to watch it.
Came up in my research that journalists, when they face burnout, they disconnect. And one of the ways how they disconnect is news avoidance. And if you look at the research on news avoidance, it's all about how to solve the problem of people avoiding the news. But actually now we're seeing research that is looking at news avoidance as a strategy to manage your emotions, to get kind of some relief and space to think and to kind of see where you are and where you want to be. And it's interesting how that in journalism research in particular, news avoidance as a practice, we're now seeing kind of not necessarily just as a problem to be solved, but as actually something that we can practice
Beneficial.
in order to kind of safeguard our well-being.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I'm going to talk about that in just a tick. Just bear with me for 10 more minutes. I know that you're at the end of the day. I want to share a story with you. It's a really important story. That's the Rixos Hotel. You might have been there in Libya. There's a lot of journalists sitting in the lobby and, you know, sharing stories. I caught up with this correspondent the other day who was in Haiti, and we had dinner, and he said one of our cameramen, he went to Haiti for the first time. He went to Haiti and he'd done loads of stuff, but Haiti was the hardest. That he did things there, he filmed things there that he hadn't had to do before. And he told this story. They arrived, and it was first in an area which had been completely decimated. And the cameraman, seasoned cameraman, was there with him. And they get out, they start filming, and there's all like cars upside down. It's just a mess. And then they go to step over some kind of debris, and the cameraman realizes that it's a young girl. And it just freezes. Like the cameraman just froze and just, you know, didn't say anything. He went really quiet. And that could be seen as coping. That could be seen as kind of the cameraman doing his job. As a clinician, that fills me with terror that that's what he did. Because where did that response actually go? Like, it just went down, 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 and became, oh, goodness knows what it became and when it came out. But so the journalist said, yeah, he became really, really angry after Haiti. He had lots of rage issues. He really struggled. But he also talked about how in the evening there was a very experienced field producer there who was they were all sitting around drinking, and he noticed that the film producer was just very casually just saying, "Oh, what did you see today?" And they were going around the circle, and everyone was just talking about what they'd seen and was drinking, was sharing stories. And this journalist said, I understood what she was doing. I saw what she was doing. Very clever field producer. She got everyone to debrief in a circle. And goodness knows what she might have helped. You know, she may have helped people. And you know, the cameraman was never the same. Like, he really, really struggled. And it's such a shame that no one understood, like, he'd swallowed that experience and it had become a moment in time frozen in his body, and it would have hijacked his nervous system, because any time that he was kind of taken back to that moment in time, his nervous system would have repeated all of that over and over again, because that's what the nervous system does. It wants to heal, and it keeps repeating and it keeps repeating until you finally look at it and then you somehow process it and get it out.
When I smell sewers, Haiti basically smell of piss, shit and corpses. That sweet smell. And when I smell a sewer, it triggers memories of Haiti for me, and it was an awful place again. It was 24/7. We set up in the Hotel Kinam over this area where people were setting up tents, IDPs. We were all sleeping on the floor, and they were all in the darkness. There was no power, and they were singing at night. It was like some sort of voodoo chant, and it was just like none of us could sleep because of this chant that was going on. So that chant and those smells will stay with me forever.
Yeah.
It's really interesting you say that, Josh, because I've got exactly the same smell issue.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, without oversharing too much at all, but it's like when I hear a jackhammer sound,
Yeah.
because they spent so much time trying to rescue people from places. Even my dad was fixing a door in our house the other day and started drilling, and I had to walk out the house, and my mum was like, "You okay?" I'm like, 13 years on, I'm okay, but I'm just going to give myself a bit of space.
Yeah.
And so I think that just recognising that is what the doctors before were talking about sensory memories. Often we just think about our senses being things we perhaps see or hear, but there's so much more than that as well. And yeah, I think it's really, really important.
So just to pick up on some of the sharing earlier, where it was like, who am I to have this? Who am I to take up space with my trauma when so many people have seen such things that are worse? So Dr. Gabor Mate, who's probably one of my favorite trauma specialists in the world, has written lots of books on trauma. He says it's not about the event at all. It's absolutely got nothing to do with what happens to you. It's about what happens to your body. And at some point you become overwhelmed. And that could be different for different people. It might be that you're in a horrible war zone or a conflict zone or the aftermath of a natural disaster. But it might be, for me, it was 14 years into my career at Sky, watching our special correspondence report from Venezuela and watching a young girl look into her mother's eyes who had a brain tumor, and there was no medicine in the hospital to treat the brain tumor. And I will never forget the way she looked into her mother's eyes. It was a completely, for anyone else, it would have just been an image that they would have glossed over. I can barely talk about it because for me it was, I think I've got the right image here. Hang on, it was that. There was the moment for me. In French, there's a great expression. The straw that broke the camel's back in English translates in French to the drop of water that made the vase overflow. So that was that photo of that young girl's eyes looking into her mother's eyes with no medicine and no hope. That was me, and that's what happened, and then I was off.
Was that an Alex Crawford story?
It was Alex Crawford's.
It was
It was, it's a very, it's the first time I've been able to talk about that and not cry, and I think it's because I've processed it in therapy, but it was just so heart-wrenching. I mean, just this girl, her face, I mean, of everything I've seen, it was her eyes that broke me.
Some of the most affecting things in a war zone aren't the war themselves, it's how they affect the people going into refugee camps or internally displaced people's camps, and seeing people in the most desperate situations and imagining there, for the grace of God, walk I, you know, it's horrible.
I think in Leona, in your book, one of the journalists talks about walking into a funeral, seeing a funeral with a 7-year-old boy who'd gone in to see the death of his father and walked into the funeral sort of saying hello to the journalists and just innocently not understanding what was about to take place. And he said the little boy who walked out afterwards, it was that broke him. This little boy, his entire world had just collapsed in that church. And I read that and I just completely resonated with, that's what happens. It's just one shot that you never forget. It stays with you. So yeah, some of what journalists are saying, this came from a journalist I sort of work with in a big London newsroom. She said, I don't want to have emotional conversations with my line manager. I don't want to get to a point where I need to do that at work. Management say that if it gets too much, we can take time off. But the problem is that by that point, the harm has already happened. We should be ensuring that staff don't get to that point where they need to take time off. If something is about to go to air and you're in a key role, you can't just say, sorry, I need the rest of the day off. I think this is really key. And I think this is why the mental health support in newsrooms, it's not correct. We haven't figured it out yet. We've got good intentions and some of it's okay. But when push comes to shove, if I, as the assistant editor on the evening news, said, I've just seen an upsetting Alex Crawford piece and it's triggered some old trauma, I'm not going to put the 9 p.m. news to air, I know very quickly that my job would not exist. So we need to be realistic, I think. There are many people who never complain. The cameraman who films the girl in the war zone and goes silent and says nothing and swallows his distress and then spends 10 years battling with alcohol addiction and rage. There are many people who never complain, but just because they're not complaining, it doesn't mean that everything's okay. So just a few things that we're doing at Safely Held Spaces, and these trainings are available to newsrooms in the UK. We're piloting them at the moment with the John Schofield Trust and Tortoise Media. Hopefully I'll take it into Sky, but they're nearly ready to go. So what I just said, let's relook at mental health and understand everything's up for debate. These are people's ideas and opinions, and actually some of them are not great, to be honest, and I would be rethinking the idea that there's things like clinically treatment-resistant depression. Really? Or is the treatment just not very good? Is there a chemical imbalance in the brain? Well, chemicals play a part. All of our experiences are mediated by molecules in our body, but to just look at the chemicals and not the experiences is to only see one side of the coin. So this is why we need to be thinking about what in mental health is contested and how does that even impact? Go right back to the start, and how does that impact what we set up in the first place? Telling trauma-informed news stories, how understanding these different worldviews actually shapes your journalism. So if you think someone's just got clinically treatment-resistant depression, you'll ask a certain set of questions. If you know that what underpins that is often severe abuse, you might say, tell me a bit about your childhood, what happened, what was it like? Gently, you'd find out if that's okay, and they felt comfortable talking about it, but you would understand that the diagnosis is the signpost and the label. The real story is in how did you get to that diagnosis? Emotionally regulated storytelling. This is when we understand that we as journalists, our capacity to be present, our capacity to listen empathically, to not butt in, to not be dissociated and drifting off with the fairies thinking about our next question, but to just listen and be present, how that leads to really, really good TV, really good interviews, really good copy. I had a friend of mine, a colleague, who was interviewed by a journalist from a national newspaper 2 or 3 days ago, and he said to me, she just wanted me to talk about my suicide attempt. And she didn't understand that she could have got him to talk about that if he'd trusted her, but he could sense her need, her desire, her hunger for the tell me about the worst bits, I think she said. I mean, can you imagine as a psychotherapist if I said, tell me about the worst bits in the first session? My God, I wouldn't last a minute with my clients. And I think it's a therapeutic relationship in some ways, the journalist-interview relationship. It's a sacred relationship in that so much as that they're prepared to talk to you about things that they wouldn't share with others, maybe not even their family. So we have to understand how going into that, you need to be grounded. You need to understand what's going on in your own body, or otherwise, we know people that are kind of not listening to us. We know when someone's got an ulterior motive. You don't need to have the ulterior motive. If you're just a good human being and you've processed your own trauma and you know how to keep someone safe when you're talking about traumatic events, they'll tell you the story. You will get better stories. And so, even if we just want to look at it from a cynical news journalistic point of view, let's do this work so that the news and that our stories are better stories. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening. There's my email, and it's been an absolute joy and pleasure to be here today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.